climate policies seem credible, or like promises without action, what would truly restore trust in the youth?
Yeah, well, I think today we see a lot of 1.5 degrees Celsius rhetoric, but that's coupled with sort of 2.7 degree policy. And obviously when young people see things like Trump putting out the Paris Agreement and Gates sort of reversing many of his policies, I think that reduces a lot of the credibility which global policy has.
Yeah, I think there's a few things to look at here because obviously environmental and climate policy is such a huge, broad topic. And if you're looking at some metrics like renewable energy, we can actually see that countries like the UK and even the US have quite, we've got quite good sustainable long-term goals. UK has surpassed 50% renewable energy, America's above a quarter. But the issue that I see, and I think that young people see and young people are disillusioned with, is that there's a lack of, there feels like a lack of ambition and a lack of vision from governments around the world who are scared of political or economic flashback from climate policy and therefore lack the drive to create larger, greater scale policies.
Yeah, I mean, following on from this, I'm not sure I agree with the fact that the ambition is now. I think that the ambition is definitely there. 2050, we have all the slogans there. I think where we're missing the ball is in the delivery. We're so focused in the 40 years in the future, we're not focusing so much in the now, in the present. Focusing in 3-year timescales instead of 30, where it can almost make the gains invisible. Very easy to push them ahead, not focus so much on them.
So I think that we're in a very worrying situation given the geopolitical climate, especially when it comes to climate change and its credibility. You have Howard Lubnick, who yesterday said that we should be wary of moving towards net zero and that there would even be tariffs threatened against much of the EU and the Eurozone. And subsequently, you could see a possibility of countries in the EU pulling out from their previous commitment to honour commitments to go towards net zero by 2030. So as a young person, I think it's quite bleak and there's a complete lack of credibility.
So I think the overall situation that we're getting of this is that net zero is feeling like a gym membership, impressive on paper, whereas it's very mysterious in practice. My second question to our panel is, how do election cycles and short-term politics influence youth citizenship or engagement?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I would go as far as to argue there's a bit of a disconnect in the fact that we have these short-term political cycles whilst we're trying to combat climate change, which is such a long-lasting issue, something that really requires long-term thought processes, not so much where we're focused on, the next election, rebranding ourselves, appealing to the majority, to the masses, creating, low taxes or whatever it is to appeal to people.
I think similarly when you see sort of tit-for-tat policies, it's like the Trump on his first day pulling out of the Paris Agreement, pulling out of $4 billion worth of pledges to green sustainable finance on his first day, undoing so much what Biden had done in his administration. It seems like we're no longer building together to build towards a more sustainable and green future, and instead we're trying to tear each other down to get ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And I think the tit for tat is exactly what it feels like, especially for young people. It feels almost like we're regressing in terms of climate policies which unite parties, which it has been in the past. You can see historically climate change has been an issue that has been acted on by both right-wing and left-wing parties, and increasingly today, as evidenced by the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and their differences, it's become almost a battleground, and we've gotten to a point where climate change denial is almost on the cards again for a government.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well because even within same party policy, we saw the Conservative Party in the UK push back the sale of diesel and electric cars from 2030 back to 2035, which again causes even more cynicism. And then when that's coupled with policies where people argue, don't eat meat or don't fly, a lot of young people, aren't quite as keen on doing that, which I think makes it very difficult to then promote sort of green policy overall. So I think if we had sort of perhaps slightly more emphasis on technologies and growth, that might be beneficial, done in the right way, of course.
Adding on to this, I think also this massive disconnect we have between Trump and Biden, it can create a confusing rhetoric for people, maybe people that are less educated on climate change and environmental issues. It can almost degrade the importance of climate change itself and undermine the urgency of acting now, where people are so divided on an issue which to us seems so clear in how we should be attacking it. It sort of implies the message that it's not so clear cut, it's not that we should act now if people can be so divided on such an issue.
So it's rare for a moderator to add on points, but I think one way that I think the youth likes to see to stop this policy whiplash is long-term budgeting, as well as, like the UK has implemented climate change committees to provide reports. So I think overall seeing bodies of people is very successful. Moving on to the next question: when our climate targets are missed, who should be held accountable, and what mechanism would actually work?
Yeah, go on. I mean, obviously, let's first tackle it from the point of how do we hold people accountable and who do we hold accountable. And I know Isabella was saying this earlier, that you need to have a clear-cut system of accountability before you enact policy, before you enact measures, so that you don't end up sort of fighting against who takes the blame for missing a climate target. Obviously, if policy is being driven by government needs to be to an extent accountable for if those targets are missed. Equally, if policy is around what corporation needs to achieve in terms of carbon budgets, etc., those corporations need to be held personally accountable for when those are missed.
Yeah, following on from your point, I really would stress that I think accountability should be assigned before the fact of failure, because otherwise it almost becomes symbolic and undermines its value in a sense.
I think from an ideological point, in politics, it's us, the people, who have to hold the governments themselves accountable, be it through exercising our liberties in voting, during voting cycles, or protesting, online, in person, whatnot. It's important to hold governments accountable to ensure that they actually implement and enforce policies which they have promised on, and then for them to create measures where we can, like in the Monetary Authority of Singapore, act upon them and have the ability to fine, and often in cases imprison even, people who are lying, greenwashing and misleading matters.
Yeah, I think effective mechanisms tend to combine themselves, so legal duties, transparent measurement and independent audits. So I think there's almost an amalgamation of climate policies, whereas they should be separated, they should be attacked at different angles. How do you guys think should governments share power with adolescents, especially in the UK where we all reside? They're planning on lowering the voting age to 16.
Well, there's always been a notion that young people should be the ones who are in charge of the climate, and I would actually say that adults have been making decisions that affect young people's lives for thousands of years, and I don't think that should necessarily stop being the case. There's a reason why young people aren't allowed to drive, buy alcohol and tobacco, or vote at these certain ages. So I think that we should continue. Obviously, we could have things like youth panels, which governments could pay more attention to. But in terms of actually giving sort of real power to the younger generations, that's not something I'd sort of be quite as pro towards.
Yeah, and I think on that, I think sharing power is not necessarily the right question, and the right question is how should governments be engaging with young people, because we as young people, we all know lots of young people who are extremely intelligent, talented, we would love to engage with policy, would love to organise themselves and discuss. And there's been a lack of formal representation for those sorts of ideas. And it's not that we're saying necessarily lower voting ages or incorporate younger people into sort of governments, but giving young people a space to talk is so important, because in the long run, things like climate change, it's our futures which are going to have to bear the consequences of climate decisions today, and we desperately need a voice, and we deserve to be heard honestly on issues like this.
Yeah, leading on from this, I think our political systems are constructed in a way that we're very much biased towards the short term, and bringing in insights maybe from the younger generations can force upon longer term perspectives, because at the end of the day, we're the ones that are going to be living with the consequences, with the impacts of climate change. So we have more of a vested interest in protecting our futures, perhaps more so than older generations. But with that being said, I wouldn't say that age necessarily being youthful would give you, authority to make decisions in a blanket sense. I think it's also important, as you said, to just take it as more of an insight, input than real decision making on the ground.
I think from a philosophical side point, what do you classify as real power? Because obviously in the UK it's voting rights, whereas on a whole world approach it could be governments attending this very boring panel or other stuff. So,
Bit harsh, Ishaan.
so I think what a follow-up question is, what do you guys would classify as real power? In just a couple of words.
Well, I think what we've been discussing here is obviously voting. That's the main form of democratic power that people can exercise in countries like the UK. Equally, we have in the UK we have this a youth parliament, and it doesn't have any power in terms of necessarily passing laws or policy that can affect young people, but it has a sort of symbolic representation of youth viewpoints. I think quite tellingly it's run by the Ministry for Entertainment rather than any other ministries. And I think that's a good point. That's a good place to start with. We've got a panel which can bring together youth voices. It doesn't necessarily give them almost an effective lobby in representing young voices, but it doesn't give them any parts, policy making powers.
I think that ends our policies side of things. We're going to follow into the sustainable financing. So, in sustainable finance, how do we stop rewarding? And what's easiest to measure? And start rewarding what's transformative?
So, in my view, the problem which we currently face is so many countries, so many authorities get access to green finance and sustainable finance if you do so little as check the box. So you end up with many firms, many companies sort of treading water and just about doing enough to meet requirements or pretend they're meeting requirements and save face through greenwashing. I think what we need to move towards is the rate of change of implementation and the velocity itself of the change, which need to be paired with an accurate deadline for how long we're going to take to implement these changes.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that so many of the problems that we have in enacting climate policy is climate change is so complicated that we're trying to focus on too many things at once. I think it would be really useful if we could focus on what is the biggest contributor to climate change, global warming, and therefore increased carbon in the atmosphere. And if we start to mostly focus and put all our efforts towards reducing the amount of carbon through things like carbon capture schemes, which I think are starting to become more proven, then that would be a very positive step forward. And afterwards we could then move into the sphere of improving global biodiversity in individual regions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very focused so much on investing more so in things that look good on paper, look good on spreadsheets, not so much things that are having real impact on the ground. It's easy to focus on maybe like carbon emissions where they're more so easy to measure, or what you have it, instead of biodiversity maybe, or jobs, or real impact on the ground, whereas more nuanced, harder to capture or quantify, perhaps, and thus like harder to market and push forward.
Can I just, forgive me Jack, I just want to sort of catch you on that point about carbon capture. I think carbon capture and storage is one of the technologies that really exemplifies the issues that we're facing with things like greenwashing and checking the boxes, as we've been talking about, because it's something that potentially looks good on paper as something that you can balance out your emissions with. We've captured X amount of carbon through this technology, or we planted this number of trees, and that balances out our budget. But we know these don't work in the long run, and we need to be focusing on systemic change, reducing the actual carbon output instead of offsetting that with some often unproven schemes like carbon capture and storage.
I think just building on that, one thing we often overlook is that there are previously tested ways of implementing green finance, and like I've already alluded to it, spoke about it, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has sort of a traffic light system where rather than being, you're not meeting the requirements or you are, it's grading on a system moving towards net zero. And to access these funds, you have to provide strict deadlines, you have to meet your sunset dates, otherwise you can face fines, otherwise you can face imprisonment, and it's this hard enforcement with tangible penalties that will actually make change.
I think a little bit of maybe a slight disagreement. I think we've got so many spreadsheets for emissions, not only carbon but methane and refrigerants, but not enough receipts for real world impact. So I think it's high time that companies, institutions start selflessly acting on climate change, because it's one of the only issues ever that humankind has faced where everyone is going to be detrimentally impacted. So for a good follow-on question, what role should public finance play to unlock private capital, and what should it prioritize?
Well, I think that the issue is that within a capitalist system, the capital usually moves towards areas which are the safest and they have the most least risk to invest in. So I think that's the role that public finance should play in sort of areas like Tuvalu or Nepal, where they could give sort of debt relief or give grants to these countries where private finance simply isn't going to flow into those areas.
I think that from simply an ideological standpoint, public finance, while it shouldn't be used to line the pockets of private companies, public finance is a tool for policy. And so whether the government itself is investing in its own renewable energy sources or prompting other private firms to do the same, we are at the end of the day ending up with the same technologies which then are developed on and become more efficient, give us more access to cheaper and more broadly spread renewable energies, which is better for the world. So in my view, it's ideologically completely fine to do that, whereas I know some people, I think, are a bit adverse to public spending to bolster private finance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion, public finance, private finance, they're of drastically different ideologies. Private finance is always focused more so on returns, whereas public finance isn't constrained to this so much, in that it doesn't have to search for these returns. Meaning that, in a sense, I think the role public finance should play is removing risk, and so that private finance is more willing to invest in high risk places, whether that be through guarantees, through first concessions. So it removes the risk from the situation, motivating private firms to invest more so in high risk areas that are more in need.
Yeah, I just think just on that, it's not the duty of private corporation and private finance to provide human solutions or climate-based solutions. It's the job of private finance to make money for shareholders. So you need a partnership between public and private finance in order to create those solutions that we're needing and currently looking probably falsely to the private sector to solve.
So I think we could argue hours and hours about public finance. So I'd just like to leave the audience with two contrasting facts, which is a positive firstly where OECD for the first time, I think since 2022, surpassed their $100 billion goal for investing in climate finance, whereas UNEP says in the year 2035, developing countries will need around 365 billion compared to the 26 billion that they're getting now. So I think finance is a really contrasting situation in the world, whereas there are many positives, but are they weighed down by the negatives? So we're now going to move into probably the best, you guys' favorite topic, which is AI. We're going to start off with data centers and how do climate benefits with the footprint of data centers and trading balance climate. How do we balance climate benefits with the footprint of data centers and trading?
Well, I think, obviously, data centers consume a huge amount of energy. I think by 2030, it's sort of supposed to consume 9% of all US energy. And so in the majority of scenarios, I would say, we probably do overhype the amount that we think AI is going to solve climate change because it's so energy intensive. But at the same time, we can point towards sort of facts like Google's DeepSeek machine learning has enabled sort of 40% reductions in water cooling costs for these data centers. So I think, to be honest, we don't really know yet, and I think the solution will most likely be in something more like quantum computing rather than things like AI. But it's an interesting pathway, and we'll see what happens.
So I think that the question of AI is really an interesting one because often you end up with sort of a paradox where you're using AI and building AI data centers to optimize and better align our energy networks so that we can have cleaner energy and there's less energy losses. Yet the paradox is then you have a trade-off, and the trade-off is data centers are so energy dependent and reliant, and they take up so much energy as well as have a fairly climate and carbon footprint heavy impact on the earth. That does the pro of being able to optimize our data centers with our energy sources outweigh the fact that our data centers are sucking in a huge amount of energy, and in fact more than 35% of Ireland's energy was only on data centers last year.
So I think we want I think a conclusion point is we want AI to optimize the grid, not the grid be a reason for AI needing therapy. So finally, a final question until we ask the floor for any questions to any of us, or we can all answer collectively, is what climate decisions should never be automated, especially where rights, equity, relocation, access, indigenous lands are involved?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a much broader point to be made here, and that's that how can we can't let AI take full control of any decision, because you need a human, you need some sort of human contact point in the loop of any decision. And I think it feeds back really well into our conversations earlier about accountability. And if you've got AI or machine optimizing or running your logistics and your decisions, and something goes wrong, how do you bring people accountable to that? You can't bring the AI to be accountable to it, it's just a machine. And you get issues like I'm sure we'll all remember coming to the UK, like the Horizon Fujitsu post office scandal, where this AI automated decision was left to its own devices, and huge ramifications were felt. People died, people were imprisoned, lives were destroyed, and we need to be at a point where humans are involved in any decision.
Yeah, I would go as far as to say the role of AI should purely be supplementary, not in its own right making decisions. Where people's lives and real outcomes are involved, I think AI runs the risk of depoliticizing really important themes and creating them into very much binary decisions of yes, no, removing any nuances or impact on the ground, contextual information about the place.
I think the EU, with its 2026 regulations on AI, which is a groundbreaking set of mandates, I think they're walking a tightrope very finely, and believe you me, it's a very small tightrope, but they've come up with a good system where they've said that certain uses of AI cannot be used. One example was for in policing, in stop and searches. It depends completely on the AI model, it depends completely on the architects of the AI model and also what data they've been fed to program them, because they will come up with inherent biases which will naturally impact certain groups.
Actually, Miles, can I ask, you had a really good point earlier about, was it companies using AI to optimize decisions about where to forest and cover and land usage? Issues?
We are in the golden era of AI, and we're so fortunate to have so many options, and so many new possibilities. But one problem with indigenous people's rights is that, based on Western ideals, many AI models are built by firms and architects which are based off these Western ideals, and they fail to recognise indigenous land. So when you look at websites which offer you where there is land available for development, or in some cases deforestation, or in some cases even reforestation, when you look at indigenous land plots, they actually come up in many cases as vacant or available for purchasing, which is a huge problem because you end up infringing on the rights of a minority group who is often suffered the most.
So I think AI as a tool is very important. So AI, in the analogy of an ambulance, it should pick the fastest route for that ambulance, but it should not pick who gets to be in the ambulance, if that makes sense. So that's our panel completed. We have about 5 minutes to spare, so I'd love to ask the floor to give us any questions.
Can you run the mic or one of the extra?
Apologies, I wasn't here for the entire session, so if you covered this, but I'd love your thoughts on a tax for AI usage. So if you have a company that's using AI like a lot and burning through those water resources, things like energy resources, what about a tax on that? They tax us for water, right? They tax for everything else. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I mean, so some AIs like ChatGPT, you can use with unlimited access, but others like Claude AI, you get a sort of given amount of credits. So I think, and that's based on a subscription membership, so you upgrade your tiers. But it's an interesting point that instead of needlessly asking AI to come up with analogies at the end of your points, if you're using up your credits, then perhaps you use it more selectively and carefully.
If I can, I think that feeds really nicely into a broader point about that AI is such a fast developing industry. I don't think anyone really quite has the finger on the pulse of what might happen next in terms of AI development. And we need some form of governance in that. We need laws, we need policies which can control and protect people from AI usage, whether that is for corporations through measures like a tax, or even for individual people. I think there's a debate to be had whether some things should be heavily policed, outlawed. About, if you look at it, we don't know. So I was going to say earlier, the answer to any question about how AI optimizes climate decisions is we don't know. What we do know, and what you can see, is that AI is being used to help students do their homework and to make sexually explicit photos of children on Twitter. And there is a serious discussion to be had, I think, over how we police and how we regulate AI, both for individuals and for companies.
I think with technology as a whole, when revolutionary technology like AI comes out, when the car came out, people were saying like horse-drawn carriages. I prefer a horse-drawn carriage. I think this is going to stop lots of jobs. We should not have any more cars being put into manufacturing. And I don't think we can imagine a world without modern transportation, without cars. So, especially in the Apple movement, when people tried making predictions about what would be the next 20 years with Apple, with the integration of Microsoft and Android into operating systems, they were completely wrong. So I think taxing AI systems, especially when AIs are very premature, they're not fully developed yet, we still don't know what's going to happen, what values and what benefits that AI could give.
I think just adding on to that, it's a really interesting point, and we have to look at it because when ChatGPT search is 10 times more pollution causing than pollution emitting than one Google search. So if, and there are stats that one 100 terawatt data center uses up the same amount of water as a 50,000 person town would. So it once again is a question of priorities, and I think taxation is an excellent way to curb the overuse of it, especially.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of a tax on AI also brings in an interesting perspective and institutional inertia. Institutions being very slow to adapt to these fast-moving, as you say, like discoveries, innovations, especially in the technology space. Equally, along the lines of actual implementation on the ground of an AI tax, I would be interested to know how it would be constructed. Would it be in a universal sense? Because I would struggle to see how we would implement this with companies maybe being less willing or moving base, moving country to avoid taxation. Almost, I feel like it's a bit of creative destruction in a sense.
I think we've got 20 seconds left, but thank you for all of your questions. I would just like to leave us on a final note. Is AI too ahead of our time? Are we too Neanderthal in a sense that AI is just this supreme being and we ask it for whatever we want? Are we too ahead of our time in terms of data centers? Have we not adequately put enough, as you said, resources into it, or do we not have enough resources for it? So that's our final note. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to all of you.
Thank you to our moderator as well.
That's all for the sessions today, and right now is an interactive session for the startups. It's going to begin in maybe next couple of seconds. So all the startups, this is a time for you to come and ask questions to the investors and connect with them and So your doubts, your questions, and your understanding about investments, everything will be in one place. I'm going to hand over to Stelina, and thank you, Stelina, for taking this taking this panel, and I'm handing my mic.
Thank you so much, Pandana. Hi, everyone. It's been a very long day. I see from the energy in your applauses. Okay, so we have. Good. Okay, so the last interaction is a little bit more interactive, and I'd like to see the investors. Maybe we can come a little bit closer. Just okay.
Or we can put the chairs. Or you can put the chairs here and.
Whatever, if you're a little bit comfortable, you did a lot of work today. So. Okay, are we all?
No.
Nicola? Okay, so before we start with questions, just a really quick presentation of our investors today. So we have with us Nicola Fintari from Sictic. Welcome, Nicola.
Hello.
Then we have Ivo Ronner. He is venture capital investor. Hi, Ivo. Welcome. We have Manuel Eppert. He's investor for women and startups. Hi there. We have